Good morning. Welcome to RISE webinar number 3, Worms and Waste with Kristen Malec from Green Action Center. Today is Wednesday, May 20th, 2020. My name is Chantel Henderson. I'm the Indigenous Programs Outreach Coordinator for the First Nations Waste Minimization Program here at Green Action Center. As everyone knows, this webinar series was created in response to the cancellation of the 2020 RISE Teachers Conference. RISE is an acronym for Recognizing Indigenous Sustainable Education. And so we work with Northern First Nation communities and schools to teach about sustainable education. So today's topic will be focusing on worms and waste. And I will introduce you to my co-host. Beth.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. And I see a lot of familiar names from the 2019 RISE Teachers Conference. So nice to see you virtually.
So some, I guess some, I don't know, house rules maybe. So basically, we're letting everyone know that all participants, attendees will have their video and audio muted. This is just to allow the presenter the opportunity to tell their presentation, and we'll use the chat box for any question and answers throughout the webinar. So feel free to send a comment, say hi, let us know what community you're from. Yeah, and if there's any technical issues on your part or our part, if there's any audio or video, let us know, and we'll try to fix the problem. Other than that, I would like to start off with our land acknowledgement. So we are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And before we begin, we have a couple of poll questions we'd like to ask our attendees, just to find out, how you heard about this webinar series. So Beth, you want to start the poll?
Sure. Okay. So here it is now launched. So hopefully you can all see it now. If you have any trouble with that, just let us know. I know yesterday on a couple of the webinars, we had 1 or 2 people, because of the computer they were using, they couldn't see the polls. So if that's the case, just let us know. Oh, and the answers are coming in. We've got about 40, almost half of attendees have responded. So we'll just let it run a few more moments here. We're almost at 60%. Oh, there we go. So basically, we're just looking for if you attended the RISE Teachers Conference last year and your connection with schools, and if you're from a First Nation, and how you heard about it. So we're at 80% now, so I will stop it there. Does that sound okay, Chantel?
Yeah.
Someone was asking how you scroll down there. You should see a bar along the right-hand side of the poll that you can use your cursor to click on that and pull the bar down. Oh, and I see in the chat box that someone is, one of our attendees is from Duck Bay and Camperville and teaches there and lives in Cowan, so that's great. Okay, well, we'll end the polling there and share the results. So actually we have most of the people on the call did not attend last year's conference. So that was interesting to see. And we have the majority of folks on the call are from a school, a teacher, 63%, and the rest are other. And we have a little over a quarter of the participants are a member of a Manitoba First Nation. And looks like email is the top choice in terms of how people heard about the webinar series. So back to you, Chantel.
Okay. All right, so this is our agenda for today. So I'm Chantel, that was Beth, and the presenter will be Kristen. So I'm going to introduce you to her. This is Kristen Malec. She's the compost program coordinator here at the Green Action Center. Kristen's passions include reducing our waste and consumption, sourcing food from small-scale farmers who practice regenerative and sustainable agriculture. Kristen receives a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences, majoring in forest ecology at the University of Winnipeg. So we'd like to welcome Kristen and take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Chantel and Beth. And good morning, everyone. How are you today? I hope you're enjoying the lovely weather. Well, in Winnipeg, it's really nice. I know a lot of you are from different parts of Manitoba, so hopefully it's just as lovely and sunny where you are today. So as Chantel said, my name is Kristen. I'm one of the composting program coordinators at Green Action Center. I'll just give you a little background about what we do in our composting program. Basically, the big intent of our composting program is to get as many people composting as possible. We do this by educating people about what composting is, and we also help people get started composting. So we do that with individuals of the public, but also we work with schools, workplaces, and community organizations getting started composting. So that involves backyard outdoor composting and also vermicomposting. So today I'm going to be talking to you about vermicomposting. So that is a type of composting you do indoors with a special type of worms. So the first part of my presentation will be a PowerPoint. So I'll share my screen and talk about what composting is, why it's so important, and introduce vermicomposting. And then about the last half or last 3/4 of the presentation will actually be focused on me, where I will talk about the different components of building a worm bin for vermicomposting, and I'll go through how to build one. I know that most of you are from, well, you're teachers, so vermicomposting is a really great thing to do in your classrooms with your students. So, and it's something way easier to do than backyard composting. So it's a really great way to get started with composting, to get into composting. It's a good step into composting. As Chantel mentioned, I will, throughout my presentation, I will stop and ask Beth if any questions have come in, and I can answer them throughout the presentation, and then there'll also be time at the end of my presentation to answer any other questions. And if you still have questions that we didn't get to, I can also go through the chat box and answer them later on. Okay, so without further ado, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so what is composting? Composting is a process in which, a natural process in which organic materials are placed into a bin, and they're break down by certain decomposers into a product called compost. So compost is not a soil, as many people think it is. It's actually a natural soil amendment or a natural fertilizer. So this decomposition process is carried out by a wide variety of microorganisms and macroorganisms, as you can see on this slide. It ranges from bacteria and fungi to earthworms, snails, sow beetles, ants, centipedes, beetles. It's like having a whole bunch of pets in your compost bin or your worm bin inside. You're not going to have the same amount of organisms in your worm bin as you do outside, but still, it's like having pets. You need to take care of them. They need 3 things to survive, just like us: food, water, and oxygen. So the food that you're giving to them is your food scraps, and if they have enough oxygen and water, then they're going to be super happy, and they're going to turn all those food scraps into wonderful, lovely compost. So, why do we want to compost? Well, there's many reasons why it's a great idea to compost. But one of the biggest reasons for me is climate change. So, in regards to Winnipeg, we actually have one of the highest levels of organics going to the landfill in Canada. We're actually one of the last cities in Canada to not have an organics curbside pickup program. In 2016, about half of the waste coming from residential sources was actually compostable. So this represented over 72,000 metric tons of organic materials. So what does that number mean? It's a really big number. To put it into context, an adult polar bear weighs about half a ton. So we send about 144,000 adult polar bears worth of organic materials to the landfill, to the Brady Road landfill. So that's Winnipeg's landfill. That's a lot of material. So one, that takes up a lot of space, so that reduces the lifespan of Winnipeg's landfill or any landfill. And we don't want to create new landfills, but also this creates methane. So methane is a greenhouse gas that's 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide is. So the Brady Road landfill is actually the second highest point source polluter of greenhouse gases in Manitoba, second to a fertilizer plant just outside of Brandon. So why is methane created in a landfill and not in a compost bin? The reason for this is there's no oxygen present in a landfill. So those compost critters that I mentioned, they require oxygen to survive. The compost critters you'll find in the bacteria you'll find in a landfill are called anaerobic bacteria, and they can actually survive without any oxygen or very little amounts of oxygen. So when they decompose those organic materials in the landfill, they actually create methane or they exhale methane instead of carbon dioxide. So if we can divert materials from the landfill, then we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and thus reduce our impacts on climate change. As I mentioned, there are other reasons why we don't want to add organics or why we want to compost. As I mentioned earlier, we don't want to have to create new landfills. It takes up valuable space that could be used for farming, or it could have been a forest, which created habitat for wildlife. Composting is nature's way of recycling. It reduces our reliance on synthetically produced fertilizers, which, as I mentioned, also creates greenhouse gases. And the overuse of fertilizers can result in it leaching into water bodies. We can save money. We don't have to buy expensive fertilizers. Compost adds nutrients to the soils. It actually increases the water retention in your soil, so you don't have to water your soils as much. And it actually improves the texture of your soils. So in Winnipeg and the surrounding area, we have really heavy clay soils. So when you add compost regularly, it actually makes it lighter and fluffier. And if you have sandy soils, then it can actually help it retain moisture a lot better. And it also just improves the health of your soils. It increases the number of soil organisms within your soils, and it'll help to fight off funguses that will affect your plants. And again, those soil organisms make the nutrients in the soil more available to the plants. And because of all of this, your plants are healthy and they grow larger, and you get just a better garden out of it. So it's a win-win situation. So I talked about composting in general, and there's different types of composting. There's small scale composting that we do outside in our backyards, vermicomposting, which I'll be talking about. Then there's also large scale composting, which a city will do when they do organics pickup. Today I'm going to focus on vermicomposting. So vermicomposting is a composting you can do indoors with a special type of worm called red wiggler worms. This is a great type of composting to do for those who don't have an outdoor space, for those who aren't maybe physically able to deal with the maintenance of a compost bin. And it's also really great if you have kids at home. It's a very cheap and easy to take care of pet. And it's also really great for a classroom. It's really interactive. The kids can really help take care of the worms. They can get up close and personal with and see how decomposition works and the whole cycle of nutrient recycling. And it's a really great way to talk about the soil system. So basically how it works is the worms eat your food scraps and they create vermicompost, which is their poop. That's liquid gold. And the great thing about vermicompost is that it's actually higher in nutrients than the compost you get from a backyard compost bin. So that's an interesting little fact about vermicomposting. Another thing that's great about vermicomposting is that it's really easy to get started. You don't need a lot to get started, and it's very inexpensive. So probably your biggest expense will be purchasing the worms. So the red wriggler worms, they're not native to Manitoba. You can't just go out and find them outdoors. You have to purchase them from, there's several breeders in Manitoba where you can buy them from. The ones that I know of are based out of Winnipeg or St. Andrews. I'm not familiar with any, I think there's one in Brandon perhaps, but I'm not sure of anywhere else in Manitoba. I can send Chantel the links of the places where you can purchase the worms from. So you have to purchase the worms from worm breeders. You'll need a bin and bedding, which I'll go into detail afterwards. A kitchen catcher or a bin to collect your food scraps. And then you need the food scraps to feed the worms. So it's really not a lot that you need. Okay, so I always talk about the red wiggler worms and a little bit about their biology so that you can better understand what they need to survive. And so you can take good care of them and they can be happy and healthy worms. So as I mentioned, red wiggler worms are native to California. So they like warm temperatures, which is great for the purposes of indoor composting. Optimal temperatures for them is about 15 to 25 degrees, but they can survive in temperatures as low as 10 degrees. But just like us, when we're cold, we're slower, we don't really want to do as much. So if they're in colder temperatures, they'll be slower at eating the food that you give to them, and they may not mate. So the warmer the temperature, the better. Red wiggler worms are they're perfectly suited for vermicomposting because they live at the surface of the soil. So they like to eat leaves, decayed wood, organic materials such as your food scraps. They don't need a big space to live. So don't get all smart and think, oh, I'll just go outside and collect some worms and use that for vermicomposting. It won't work out. Earthworms, they need big, deep areas. They like to go deep into the soil. The bins that you use for vermicomposting won't be deep enough. They like cooler temperatures. The bins that we use are too warm for them. And they also create burrows, and they don't like those burrows to be disturbed. And you're going to be disturbing them all the time when you add food to the worm bin. So you will definitely have earthworms escaping your bin because they're going to look for a place that they like better, a better place to live. And then they're just going to die and dry up on your floor. So you're going to have dried up earthworms in your house or your classroom. So don't try and use earthworms. You want to stick with the red wiggler worms. Something that's pretty cool about the worms is that they don't have lungs. They actually breathe through their skin. In order to do this, they need to have a moist environment. Their skin needs to be moist. So if it's too dry in the bin, then they won't be able to breathe. And the same goes for if it's too wet, they would drown. So it's important to maintain a optimal moisture level. It doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you don't want them to dry out or to drown. They're hermaphrodites. So earthworms have both male and female reproductive organs, but they still need another worm. Did I say earthworms? Maybe I did. If I did, I meant red wiggler worms. Well, they need another worm to mate with. So basically, it's called their clitellums, which develop when they're sexually mature. They rub against each other, and an egg casing is created. So on the top right-hand corner of the slide shows a photo of little egg cocoons or casings, and that's where the little worm develops. And as the worm develops, the color of the egg casing will increase. It'll get darker. And when it's like a dark browny red color, that's usually when it's ready for the worm is ready to hatch. So it's always fun to try and look for little worm eggs with kids. They're about the size of the head of a pin, so they're very small. They're quite tricky to look for. So basically, when you start off with worms, if they're happy and healthy, then they'll increase in population. Eventually, they'll only be able to increase in population so much because they'll only increase in population as much as the bin can support them. So if you want to continue increasing that worm population, then you have to get another bin and just take some bins some worms from your original bin and put it in a new worm bin, and then those bins, those worms will start mating with each other and make more babies and more worms. You can become a little worm breeder yourself and sell the worms or give them to friends. Something that's pretty cool about them is they eat their own body weight every day. And in captivity, these worms can live as long as 4 years, which is pretty cool. All right. So I talked about the worms. I'll talk to you a bit about what you can feed them. So they eat there's many things you can feed them. Fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, they can be raw or cooked, doesn't matter. Tea leaves or bags, just make sure the tea bags are not those plastic mesh bags. Indoor plant clippings, crushed eggshells. If you put them in not crushed, then they're going to take forever for them to break up and decompose. Then it'll just take up lots of room in the worm bin, so crushing them up is a good idea. Their favorite food is melons for some reason. In moderation, you can add coffee grounds and citrus fruits. So both of those items are high in acidity, and you don't want the bin to become too acidic. Also with citrus fruits, they have, there's an oil in the skins that can become toxic to worms if they eat too many citrus fruits. And then you can also give them breads and grains and plain pasta. Like, you know, even if there's tomato sauce on the pasta, I don't think it's a big deal, even with some oil. The things you do not want to feed to your worms are any type of meat product. It's going to smell really bad. Like, I know there actually are some people who've been vermicomposting for a long time where they will add meat to their bin, but I would not recommend it starting out. You don't want to add any whole eggs, dairy products, diseased plants. The composting process doesn't kill off the fungus or whatever is causing the issue in the plant. They don't like garlic and onions for some reason. You also don't want to add pet waste. Again, there's pathogens in dog and cat poo that will not be killed off by the composting process. But if you do have a hamster or a rabbit, any animal that only eats vegetables, that's actually okay to compost their waste. And it's really high in nitrogen too, so that's totally fine. And you can add their bedding to the bin as well. So it's actually quite perfect. And of course, we don't eat plastic, metal, or synthetic materials, and the worms won't either. Okay, so usually people tend to have questions at this point. Beth, are there any questions that have come in?
The only thing that's been asked, Kristen, is if you could share the links to purchase worms.
Oh, yeah. So yeah. I'll be doing that later on, or I'll get Chantel to do that.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. All right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Pardon me, there is one question.
Oh, okay, sure.
Do they eat banana peels?
Oh, they definitely do. And they eat a lot of banana peels in our office because that's a common thing that people bring to work. So yeah, that's totally fine. All right, so I talked about the worms and what they can eat. Now I'll go through the other main components that you need for vermicomposting. I mentioned some sort of container to use to collect your food scraps. to feed to the worms. So here's some examples of collection containers. This one is plastic, has air holes on the top to vent any smells out. It's a nice size. They sell for about $10 at Canadian Tire. I know Home Hardware sells them too. This metal one, this is ours at our house, costs about $30 to $40. It's much more expensive. You don't need a metal one. I like it just because it'll last forever and it doesn't absorb smells. Or you can just use empty 4-liter ice cream pails, yogurt containers, margarine containers. You know, it doesn't have to be anything fancy.
Yeah, I want to say that I got my compost bin from Dollarama's for $4. So.
Oh, there you go. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, you don't have to get fancy. You can find some inexpensive options for sure, especially if you're doing it for a school and you need more than one compost collection container. You can put the word out to parents, say, hey, if you have any empty ice cream pails, bring them to school, we can use them. So yeah. The next thing that, next most important thing that you want to need for vermicomposting is a bin. So this is about the largest bin that you would want for vermicomposting. You don't want anything deeper than this, because if it is deeper, then the vermicompost at the bottom will start to get really compacted and it's going to get smelly because there's no oxygen. And you're going to have those anaerobic bacteria and they're going to be creating methane, and that's when things get really stinky. So don't do anything deeper than this. We have one of these at our office, and then also a small one, this one, that we use, which is nice and portable for taking to schools or other presentations. You want to make sure that the bin is not clear, because worms they like darkness. So make sure it's not fully clear. And when you decide where to put the bin, don't put it in a spot that gets really hot. So don't put it in front of a window where it gets lots of sunlight, or on top of a heating vent, because then it'll just get too hot in the bin for the worms. So when you're starting off with a bin, you want to make sure that it has air holes. Again, those worms need oxygen. So if you don't drill any holes into your bin, then they're going to suffocate. I'm not going to drill holes into this bin because I don't actually want to use this bin for vermicomposting, but I'll just use this bin to show you the size of the holes. They don't need to be big. They're about maybe 1/4 of an inch in size. I'll just put this here, lower my camera. Hope you can see that. I don't know, it's taking a while for the camera to adjust. But yeah, there's a bunch of, you can see that? Okay, great. So there's, we have holes all along the sides of the bin. And then we have holes drilled into the lid. And we also have holes drilled into the bottom. So you don't have to have holes drilled into the bottom of the bin. It's just people like to have that in case there's too much moisture, and then the moisture can seep out of the holes into a bin like this underneath it, or a tray. You want to have a bin or a tray to catch that excess moisture, or it's going to be really gross on your floor. There's a lot of people that decided that they're okay with, they're fine with regulating the moisture in the bin, and they just don't drill holes on the top. You can also choose not to have a lid on your bin. In that case, you would just want to put like a layer of wet newspaper on the top just to keep things from drying out. Because if you don't have any lid at all, any type of covering over the top of the vermicompost, the interior of the bin, then it's going to dry out quite quickly. Okay, so once you drill the holes into your bin, you can even use a hammer and nail if you don't have a drill. It'll just take a lot longer. Good project for kids. You need to think about bedding. So what is bedding? So bedding is shredded paper, office paper, shredded newspaper. Bedding is a brown. So just like us, we need food groups to keep healthy. And those compost critters also need two food groups, greens and browns. So greens are the food scraps and the fresh plants that we add to the bin. They're high in nitrogen and kind of really get the composting process going, or the decomposition process going. And browns are drier materials like leaves, straw, paper, cardboard. They're high in carbon. So what the browns do is like they're a food source, but they also provide a medium for the worms to live in when you first build your bin. You can't just put them in an empty bin. And they also help to keep the compost aerated, so they keep it nice and fluffy. And it also helps to reduce smells and fruit flies. So it's very important to add that to your bin as well. In here, in this bin right here, I have a whole bunch of shredded office paper from our office. It's a great inexpensive material to use. Same with shredded newspaper or shredded paper bags. What I have here is coconut coir. We started using this recently. It's actually really nice as a bedding for the worms. It's actually a byproduct of coconuts. So it's something that it doesn't go to waste. It's from the husk of coconuts. So it's actually sold at gardening stores. So it comes in a big cube, and then you just soak it in water in a bucket and it expands like crazy. We found this actually does a nicer job than the shredded paper, but it's not free. So if you want a free material, shredded paper is totally fine. So when you're building your bin, you have your bin, you have the holes all drilled. You want to fill your bin with about 3/4 full, like, well, about maybe 2/3 full with bedding. Even this amount, like this is about half full. That should be enough too. But when you put the bedding in your bin, it's going to be all dry, and that's not a good thing for the worms because that will just completely dry them out. So once you add all of the shredded paper to the bin, then you're going to want to use a spray bottle and just go nuts with spraying. My spray bottle isn't working right now, but I'll just pretend that I'm spraying water. And you want to get it nice and moist. You can even just dump some water in there too. It takes a while with a spray bottle to get it moist. You don't want it sopping wet. You basically want it wet enough so that when you take a handful, it feels like a damp wrung out sponge. If you have water dripping from when you squeeze it, then that's too wet. So just add some more bedding and mix it in. So once you have the bedding in place, then you add the food. So people always ask, well, how much food should I add? It's always better to underfeed your worms than overfeed your worms. The food that you add to the bin, it's high in moisture. So if you add too much at once, then it's going to cause the bin to be too wet. And if a bin is too wet, you'll have several problems. One, it can cause the worms to drown. Two, it will make things really stinky and gross. And the worms will just kind of be all at the top trying to survive. If you do find that your bin is too wet, you can actually just try, you can like tip it and try to drain some of the water. But yes, so it's better to underfeed than overfeed. Worms can actually last a long time without food. A common mistake people will make is if they go away for 3 weeks or a month, they'll just load the bin with food because they don't want their worms to starve. But actually, in the end, they end up killing their worms because they drown in the moisture, in the excess moisture. So yeah, worms can live for a long time without food. Yes.
There's a question that leads up to that. So Lori, I believe, asked, how often would you feed them? Every meal, once a day?
So it's actually not often at all. So with our bin this size and the small bin, we actually only feed them about once every 2 weeks. What you wanted, so worms have really small mouths because they're small and they don't have teeth or anything. So when you add the food to the bin, the food actually has to become mushy and start to decompose before the worms can actually start sucking up the pieces of food from the food scraps. So what I do is, like, once a week I'll check the bin, and if I see that there's still food remnants in there, then I'll usually wait another week to feed them. Maybe I'll add a couple other items, but I won't add much. I was gonna say something, but now I forgot. Yeah, oh yes, this is what that's the disadvantage of vermicomposting, is that it doesn't have the same capacity for food scraps as a backyard bin. So with your outdoor compost bin, you can, dump a huge amount of food scraps into the bin. It's fine, but you can't do that with a worm bin. Something that you can do is you can store any excess food scraps in the freezer so that they don't get stinky and gross. But when you are ready to use some of those food scraps from the freezer, just make sure you let them thaw out and squeeze out the excess moisture before putting it into your bin. And again, how much you add, it's not a huge amount. So I'm just gonna lower the camera a bit. So whenever you add food to a bin, you want to push aside the bedding, or if you already have a bin that's been working, the vermicompost and the bedding, so that you have an open space all the way down to the bottom, and then you add the food. So I would add the food so that it covers from this end to this end, and maybe about this high, like only a quarter of the way up the bin. And then once you do that, always make sure you cover the food scraps with the bedding or the vermicompost. If you don't cover the food scraps, then that's when you're going to get fruit flies, or things are going to get stinky and moldy too. Fruit flies need exposed food to lay their eggs on, but if it's not exposed, then they have nowhere to lay their eggs, so then you shouldn't have an issue. And usually when I add fresh food, I'll usually add bedding, but it all depends. Like if I notice that the bin is a little dry, then I won't add any more bedding at that point, because then it'll just dry out the bin even more. Yeah, so, and also like say 1 week I'll add bin food to this side of the bin, then the next time I feed the worms, I'll add it to the next side of the bin. So I just kind of rotate adding food as you go along, just kind of to keep things evened out.
I just want to let you know we have about 5 minutes left for, I guess, to include Q&A, and we have a few questions in the chat box.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm pretty much done. So if you once you add the food, then you're good to go. And then you add the worms into your bedding. And how do you know when you're ready to harvest? Usually they you have finished vermicompost within a month, but we usually don't harvest until like the compost is about up to here, because it takes quite a while. And this is what finished vermicompost looks like. I want to show everyone what it looks like. So it's like crumbly and brown, and it smells like dirt. It smells quite lovely. Like, yeah, so there's no smells and it looks like that, then it's good to go. And yes, let's go to questions, Chantal.
Yeah, I think she's giving it over to me. We have a long question actually from Ivan that I think you may need to actually read yourself, Kristen.
Okay.
But before that, there's a question from Diana.
Okay.
She was wondering, how do we move compost bins from outdoors to indoors in the colder seasons?
So from outdoors, so Diana, are you wondering if you are you thinking putting your vermicomposting bin outside and then bringing it inside? Don't fully understand the question.
We have two questions about that, and that's what I'm wondering. Someone else has asked, in the wintertime, how do you take care of the worms? Can they survive in cold weather? So I think there is maybe a misunderstanding that the vermicompost bins are outside, not inside.
Got it. Yeah, so these compost bins are pretty much designed to be inside all year round, like summer, fall, spring, winter. You can put the bins outside in the summer, but you don't really need to do that. And then there's chance of other bugs that could get into the bin, which aren't a huge deal, but some of them may be predatory and will eat the worms. So for the most part, there's really no need to have the bins outside. You can just keep them inside. That's what they're designed for. Any other questions?
Well, there's this one from Ivan about, he says, I know Haiti, for example, uses, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, thermophilic composting for eco-sand purposes, composting of human excrement. He says, I know these high temps are necessary to make the compost safe, but is it feasible, or has there been any research done regarding first stage composting using red wrigglers? Could they, in theory, break down excrement more efficiently than just regular compost piles? Do you have any information regarding this?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't really have, like off the top of my head, I don't have much knowledge about that, but I do know that if you have a large, like at one of the worm breeders, like on their, I'll say worm ranch, they have large piles of manure where the worms live, and they can actually decompose a animal carcass very quickly. Like I think it's within a couple of days, like even the bones are completely decomposed. So I would not be surprised at all if it's possible to use vermicomposting to decompose human excrement. I know large municipal composting systems are able to decompose human waste and make it so that it is safe to be used afterwards. I don't know how it compares to vermicomposting, but yeah, I'm sure that's an option for large-scale vermicomposting. That's a very interesting question.
Okay, and then another one, there's a couple questions about, do you use worms in backyard compost too? Oh,
yeah, like can you put your red wigglers into your backyard compost bin? Yeah, you could do that. There's not really a need to do that because you're going to have the worms that like the earthworms and other soil organisms in your backyard compost bin that are going to get into your bin and do all of that decomposition work. But some people will actually put their red wiggler worms in their compost bins in the summer and then collect them later on when it's getting colder. And I think it's not too hard to collect them because again, they're just going to be kind of on the surface of the compost pile, so you don't really have to do much digging.
Oh, okay, so you would actually take the worms from the outdoor compost bin and bring them inside in the winter?
Yeah, the red wiggler worms like that you already have, you can actually place them into your compost bin in the summer. They can live out there in the summer, and then when it gets cold, then you can just collect them out of your outdoor compost bin and put them into your vermicompost bin for the winter and the fall.
A related question is about, you know, when you use the compost to mix in with soil for planting, do the worms end up going in there as well, or when you harvest the compost, like what happens with the worms?
Yeah, so I kind of ran out of time about harvesting. So there's several methods to go about harvesting the vermicompost. So you can just basically move the vermicompost to one side and then put their favorite food, melons, on the empty side, and you just wait a while, and then the worms would be like, ooh, watermelons or melons, and then they'll all go to the melon side, and then they'll leave the vermicompost pretty much worm-free, and you can take that all out. Maybe I'd still say like pick through it, see if there's any stragglers left behind. You can even check for eggs if you want to, but that takes a lot of work. Another thing you can do is you can just dump the whole contents of your bin onto a tarp or a lid and just pick the worms out. There's another method where you, because they don't like light, so use a flashlight, shine it on the interior of the bin, and then scoop away the top couple layers of vermicompost, and then shine a light again. They'll go deeper, and then scoop away the next couple layers of compost until you get to the bottom layer, and then you just have to pick through the vermicompost and take all the worms out. So yeah, that's how you harvest the vermicompost without losing all your worms. Thank you for that question. That was a very important one.
All right.
Yeah.
I think that was it. Did we answer them? Yeah, we got them all. Beth?
Do you have time to show a real live worm before we go?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna move the camera down again. So they like to cluster around food. So, there guys. I found a banana peel. Speaking of bananas, they like this banana. I'll let it focus. Can you see the worms there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're very small. My 3-year-old absolutely loves the worms. She loves to pick them up and just look at them. They're very small.
Wow.
So they're not big at all, like the earthworms. And they're like a reddy orange, brownish color. So yeah.
And just to clarify, Kristen, then the reason why it's when you do backyard composting, you end up with earthworms in there, it's because the backyard composts are much deeper and bigger?
Yeah, exactly. So the earthworms can come and go from the bin as well, because when you have an outdoor compost bin, the bottom is open. So when you place it on dirt or grass, so all of those organisms you'd find in the soil, like earthworms, well, bacteria, all those little fun little bugs, they will migrate into the compost bin outdoors from the bottom up. So outdoor compost bins are about this deep, at least. I can't really see my other hand. So it's a very different system than what you would find in a vermicomposting bin.
So we've got a request for printed information and instructions, and so I was saying that when we send out the link for where to buy the worms, that we can include a link to the printed resources, because we have a PDF of that on the website.
Yes. Yeah, so this is a super handy booklet. We have the PDF on the website, as Beth said, so Chantel or Beth can send the link to that webpage. And it also lists 2 places where you can buy worms in here. And also another great resource that I absolutely love is called Worms Eat My Garbage. And it's a super comprehensive book about vermicomposting, but it's very easy to read. And it's available at the Winnipeg Public Library. Not sure about other libraries throughout Manitoba, but it's a great resource, and you can order it online too.
Well, and Chantel, we'll be sending we recorded this webinar, and we'll send the link to everyone, right?
Yes, we will.
Excellent.
All right.
Great.
So
well, thank you for watching, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your presentation, Kristen.